1918. I'm actually not going to talk too much about Crown Prince Ruprecht today. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Certainly he provides the background for what I'm going to talk about, and the view that I am going to present to you today of the German spring offensives is largely mediated through his diaries and through his letters, and there is more available in the book, which I am squalidly commercial about. I am an unashamed whore. But what I want to talk about really is the fact that, although 1918 witnessed the greatest battles fought on the Western Front, and indeed the greatest battles ever fought in Western Europe, and that these battles were the battles which at least concluded, if they didn't necessarily decide the First World War, they still remain, I think, pretty poorly understood. And I don't think very many people, if pressed, would nominate 1918 as the most successful year in the history of the British Army. But I think you can make a very good case that it was. Never before or since has the Army exerted such strategic weight and advanced Great Britain's foreign policy aims as completely as the Army did in 1918. It helped to defeat the Central Powers. It helped to end the First World War. It ensured that Britain had an important seat at the peace conference in Paris. And all the while, it was also safeguarding and indeed reinforcing and extending Britain's imperial position around the globe. So what I'm going to talk about today is obviously the Western Front specifically, because it was there that the British Army, for the first and the last time in its history, played a leading role in the defeat of the main enemy in the primary theatre of operations. It was British soldiers and airmen, together with their American, Belgian, and French allies, which fought a whole series of battles which altogether broke the spine of the German army, shattered the nerve of its leadership, and helped to force Germany to beg for peace. Between March and November 1918, Sir Douglas Haig's British Expeditionary Force fought, first of all, in the spring, a whole series of heavy German onslaughts to a standstill, and then during the late summer and the autumn, as you all know very well, alongside its allies, went on the attack, overrunning multiple successive lines of defence and liberating great swathes of Belgium and of France, until finally the German High Command was left with no option but to request an armistice. What I want to do today is to explore some of what underpinned this rare military achievement. And I've divided the talk into three main sections. First of all, I'll outline the situation around New Year 1918. Secondly, talk about the defensive fighting that was undertaken in the spring of that year. And then, thirdly, suggest some reasons for the Allies' success during 1918, with a very brief look forwards to the 100 days. And overall, I'm going to argue, at the risk of eating my own sandwiches, that the BEF owed its victory to a variety of factors, which included improved tactical and operational skill, resilient morale, improved leadership at every level, but also, crucially, weaker opposition from a German army which had run out of men, materiel, and ideas. So let's start off by looking at the situation at the beginning of 1918. I think it's notable that the BEF's successes in 1918 were especially remarkable because it had begun the year in something very close to a crisis. 1917 had been a year of disappointments. Battles such as Arras and Third Ypres had yielded apparently little more than over 800,000 British casualties. And although Douglas Haig continually was protesting that the German army was on the brink of collapse, for Prime Minister David Lloyd George, at least, he could see little sign of this happening imminently. So Lloyd George decided to send Douglas Haig a message to clip his wings. First of all, by purging Haig's staff, the GHQ staff, as many of you will know. And secondly, by refusing GHQ's demands for 650,000 fresh troops to fight the campaign of 1918 and only sending 100,000 instead. The idea being very much, I think, and I'm about to be corrected on this, no doubt, by Alison, but that Lloyd George thought that there were better uses for manpower either in other theatres or in the factories, or for that matter in the future, rather than in another series of bloody, and as he saw it, futile campaigns led by Douglas Haig on the Western Front. One of the consequences of that, of course, was that the War Office decided to reorganise the British Army, BEF I should say, breaking up a number of divisions and reducing the infantry in all divisions, most of the divisions, from 12 to 9 battalions. Now, in principle, the idea of reducing the reliance on manpower in favour of firepower and machines, I think, can be seen as a sensible one. But obviously the timing of this reorganisation, which caused disruption to every formation near as damn it on the Western Front, was extremely unfortunate because it was only concluded on the 4th of March 1918. A second consequence of this manpower shortage was that no thought was given to any kind of preemptive attack to disrupt the German plans for an offensive. Allied intelligence knew that the Germans were going to attack in the spring. They didn't know exactly when, but they'd seen the divisions being transferred over from the Eastern Front to France and to Belgium. They had a pretty good idea where the attack was going to be. They knew it was going to be in the sector on the right of the British line, sort of south of Arras, against the 3rd and certainly the 5th Armies. As I say, the only thing they weren't quite sure of was exactly when it was going to happen. The third consequence of the manpower shortage was this, was that it undermined the British attempt to establish a solid defence. I think it's easy to forget that the British had actually relatively little experience of fighting defensively. After all, since the end of 1914, the BEF had largely, at least at the strategic level, been on the offensive. But the successful German counterattack at Cambrai on the 30th of November 1917 had highlighted how fragile British defences could be, and the fact that this German attack was clearly, large-scale German attack was clearly imminent, concentrated minds quite effectively. So on the 14th of December 1917, GHQ issued instructions on organising the defence. That's the map. Well, you all know that by heart, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. And that is a schematic of the defence in depth that the British Army tried to operate, supposedly, that's what we'll discuss, in the spring of 1918. Now, I'm not going to go into detail. Again, I suspect most of you are very well aware of how this was supposed to work. The key point, however, is that the British Army at the end of 1917, beginning of 1918, was trying to move away from a traditional forward crust defence, which basically meant holding the front line as hard as you possibly could and shooting down any attackers as they tried to cross no man's land, in favour of an elastic defence in depth scheme arrayed in depth, as you can see, over several miles deep, within which there was a degree of flexibility. So you sort of roll with the punches a little bit and then launch counterattacks to retake any ground that had been taken. That, at least, is the way it's presented. As I say, we'll interrogate that a little bit more closely in a moment. Now, the manpower problem with this is that obviously it requires a lot of manpower to build all the fortifications in depth on a scheme like this. And because the manpower wasn't available, as many of you will know, that was simply impossible in the time that they had at their disposal. A lot of combat troops were drafted in to dig at the expense of training time and rest time. But nonetheless, some sectors of the front, they completed all their defences, but particularly in the 5th Army sector in the south, they were a long way short of it. The second bit of this that's to do with manpower is that if you're relying on counterattacks to retake any ground lost, well, you've got to have reserves available to launch those counterattacks. And if the reserves don't exist, the counterattacks can't be made, and that also has a further morale impact on the forward garrison, who are cut off waiting for a counterattack they know is never going to come. Inevitably, the temptation, the tendency is to put the white flag up. There were two other problems undermining British attempts to mount a defence in depth. And the first and the most obvious one was that many British officers were uncomfortable with this approach just because it was partly because it was unfamiliar, undoubtedly. There's also, you can imagine, a psychological problem here. How do you tell soldiers who have fought, or their comrades have fought and died to capture this ground, that you're going to voluntarily give it up, which is an essential part of it? So there's a psychological problem. There's a lack of practice in command and communications and counterattacks, all of which were essential for this kind of scheme to work well. But there was a second and even more fundamental problem with Defence in Depth, however, which concerned not merely the way it was implemented, but actually the very concept. Now, to us, with the benefit of 100 years of hindsight, who know how modern warfare evolved in the Second World War, most particularly, and, for example, NATO plans for the North German Plain during the Cold War, to us, Defence in Depth seems natural and obvious response to the challenges, some of the challenges of modern war. But in 1917 and 1918, it was still a very highly contested concept. The way that the history has been written has tended to flatten out the level of dispute about whether defences should be forwards and crust or in-depth and flexible. But actually there was still an awful lot of people on both sides, British and French, who just thought it was a very bad idea, largely for the morale reasons that I've already mentioned. This is a pretty complex story, and it may be better to discuss it in more detail in Q&A than to try and outline it here. What is clear, however, is that the British Army was very far from ideally prepared to face the German offensive when it started on the 21st of March 1918. I want to talk a little bit about planning of those offensives from the German side. Now, you can go quietly mad reading the different German plans for these offensives. There's several months of memoranda going backwards and forwards with different objectives and different approaches and so on and so forth, as all the arguments were played out within the German High Command, OHL. But if you sort of strip away the noise about them, I think there are some fundamental truths. And the first is that this was essentially a forlorn hope by the German High Command. It was an attempt, obviously, to try and win the war before America could make her weight truly felt. But what Ludendorff did, instead of putting together a carefully calibrated plan which took account of available means, mobilized them in appropriate ways to achieve realistic and sensible ends, strategic and political ends, instead what Ludendorff essentially did was threw his troops into battle and tried to make it up as he went along. He had no chance of achieving his objectives because he hadn't set any realistic and strategic objectives. He's been much criticised for an over-focus on tactics at the expense of strategy. But actually, I think he kind of has a point. It wasn't entirely irrational to start off by thinking about tactics. As he pointed out, and I quote, "Without tactical success, there could be no strategy. Strategy which gives no thought to tactics is doomed to failure," end quote. But what this doesn't do, I think, is absolve him from the responsibility for working up contingency plans, which he didn't really do, for calculating what he could realistically achieve with the resources that he had available, which again, I think he failed to do, and of developing a clear idea of the best way to employ military force to achieve his political objectives. And Ludendorff did none of those things. His belief that he could break up the enemy coalition and force peace negotiations was based much more on hope than on analysis. And I suspect, although it's unfortunately impossible to prove one way or the other, maybe that's not unfortunate, I suspect that he decided to attack less because he genuinely believed that he would win the war than because he was not prepared to admit defeat. Now, just because we can see, again, from our perspective today, that the German offensives were probably doomed from the beginning because of this poor planning, doesn't mean, of course, that the BF didn't have to put up a hell of a fight. I'm not going to go through what happened day by day in the offensives. You all know the outline of the story. Two major attacks, 21st of March, Operation Michael, and the 9th of April, Operation Georgette. Michael in this area, south of Arras, down to St. Quentin, and then Georgette, of course, up in towards the Lys. We're going to hear more about that later. These are the two biggest battles, so far as the BF are concerned, in the spring of 1918. There's another one which I'll come to a little bit later, which kind of gets written out of the history because it doesn't fit the history terribly well. We'll discuss that in a second as well. But what is important is that the BF was forced to give up pretty much all the ground that it had fought and bled through 1916 and 1917 to gain, and suffered extremely heavy casualties in the process. Between March and May, the BF lost 366,937 men. 1 in 4 of the frontline fighting troops. In many of the fighting divisions, losses in the infantry were well over 50% in these months. Intense losses. Over 150,000 of those 366,000 were dead, confirmed dead, or had gone missing. Many of them had become prisoners. Germans took 40,000 prisoners in the first 3 days of the offensive, which was more than they had taken in the previous 3.5 years of the war. Either way, 150,000 of those 366,000 were never coming back. And French casualties and German casualties were equally heavy and horrendous. French over 100,000, and the Germans probably about 500,000, 400,000, 500,000, something like that, in those first two major offensives. Put the British Army under intense stress. There's no two ways about that. However, by the end of April, apart from a few unlucky British divisions which were transferred down to the French sector for arrest and got in the way of further German attacks, that was pretty much the end for the BEF of the German offensives. Now, just to come on and analyse these a little bit, there's a very deceptive apparent symmetry to these battles, which I think ignores some real differences between them and entrenches an oversimple narrative among military historians about these German offensives. If you listen to the consensus, what I would call the consensus view of the German offensives of spring 1918, well then all the German operations adhere to a pretty common pattern. And that common pattern is one of brilliant German tactics, outthinking and outfighting brave but weak British defences, German tactics characterised by mobility, aggression, storm troops. There are some storm troops with a captured British tank. Decentralised command, huge emphasis on maintaining the momentum of the attack so that any British strong points were bypassed and left to be mopped up by follow-on forces later. And that these tactics altogether overran a system of defence which the British had cribbed from the Germans, not terribly well, that the British had failed properly to grasp or properly to apply, or a bit of both. Again, this consensus narrative would go on. British command and control were paralysed, while the soldiers of the BEF, often cut off in small units, fought bravely but in vain and seemed unable to stem the field grey tide. British commanders, beset by communications breakdowns, failed to coordinate effective counterattacks, instead too often falling back to avoid encirclement, just creating more gaps for the storm troops to exploit with glee. However, despite these excellent German tactics, the German offensives, the consensus narrative goes, were then undercut, undermined, let down by their logistics, first of all, and by operational and strategic errors made by Ludendorff. Those operational and strategic errors would normally be classified, I think, probably as three. One would be dividing the attack between two different army groups, so there's no unified command for the German offensive in the first place, apart from Ludendorff, who's got a few other things on his mind at that time. That's the first one. The second one is at the end of March, he gets overconfident, thinks that he's already defeated the British, and therefore that he can divide his forces to both finish off the British and defeat the French all at the same time, and that proves to be mistaken. And the third one is the David Zabecki argument, which is that if only the Germans had captured Amiens and had seen the importance of Amiens and driven for it properly, then that might have been more successful. So these strategic and operational errors by Ludendorff, as I say, combined with logistic weakness and overtiredness of the troops and an inability to maintain the momentum of the German offensive, mean that it was doomed. That's a picture of Ludendorff looking particularly implacable. Now, the point about this consensus narrative is, if you think about it, it's primarily one about the German army, isn't it? What it's doing is it's assuming, or the hidden assumption that underlies it, is that the Germans would have succeeded if they just hadn't happened to have made a few mistakes along the way. And it feeds into a view that the tactics that were used on both sides, but particularly the attack tactics used by the Germans, then feed in, first of all, to the blitzkrieg tactics of the Second World War, and indeed to offensive tactics in modern warfare more generally. It also fits very neatly, or is totally tied up, in fact, with an idea that the German army in the first half of the 20th century was this sort of paradigm of military excellence, that if you can strip aside its political role, well, Nazi evil, basically, and imperial miscalculation under the Kaiser. If you view it purely as a technical, tactical, military fighting machine, that it was in some way better than all the other militaries around the world at that time. So that's, I think, and the fact that people want to believe those two things, the modernity of German tactics and the excellence of the German army in the first half of the 20th century, kind of feed back into the way that people look at the offensives of 1918. That's the point I'm trying to make. That's certainly the way that the German historians wrote it. Now, the problem, as I see it, with this myth of the spring offensives in 1918 is that the reality was much more, well, there are two problems with it. First of all, reality was much more nuanced than that. And secondly, German failure was, yes, to some extent, the result of German shortcomings and mistakes, but it was equally the result of things that the British and the French actually did right. Even on the 21st of March, the poster child, if you like, for German success in these offensives, success was very far from uniform. Yes, on the German left wing in the far south, they advanced 13 kilometres, an unprecedentedly large advance. But on the right, on the 21st of March, the progress was much less impressive. They struggled to make 5,000 metres, ended up a good 8 kilometres short of their objectives. And it's just simply not true that all German assault troops were capable of operating at the very highest level. If one contrasts, for example, the success of the tactical success of the 21st of March or the 9th of April with Operation Mars on the 28th of March, we get a very different story. Operation Mars tends to get downplayed in the historiography, precisely as I hinted earlier, because it doesn't fit this pattern of German tactical excellence. In fact, Operation Mars, which was just around and south of Arras, was badly botched. Bombardment was far less thorough than it had been the previous week. Counter-battery fire was far less effective. The barrage rolled forwards too quickly. Not all the troops had been trained in stormtroop tactics, and in any case, the British positions around Arras were much more well established and complex than they were further south. So the gaps that enabled small group manoeuvre and infiltration on the part of the German stormtroops simply didn't exist, and the Germans were forced to revert to a much more traditional close order attack. There was little fog on the 28th of March to mask the assaulting troops, and therefore the British, who, by the way, were not operating a defence in depth in this sector at all because the terrain enabled them not to, were able to shoot the German attackers down as they crossed no man's land. The attack was a disaster, and it was cancelled by the early afternoon of the same day, 28th of March. Even where the new tactics were followed, throughout both March and April, German troops repeatedly seemed unable to shake the habits of trench warfare and to keep up with the tempo of operations. And in terms of artillery, and I'm sure there are some gun experts in the room, although some units certainly did use the Pulkowski method of firing by the map in an effort to retain surprise, others didn't, and there was no common doctrine within the German army as to how to use artillery in the offensive until about the end of May 1918. And lastly, and I think most importantly probably, far from leaving subordinates free to use their initiative within a decentralized model of command, Auftragstaktik, mission command, whatever you want to call it, Corps, Army headquarters, and indeed Ludendorff himself have been trying to exercise much too much control, micromanaging all the way down the hierarchy, such that whatever the shortcomings of German logistics and strategy and strategic decision-making, any initial success that the Germans enjoyed, for example on the 21st of March, depended at least as much on other contingent factors such as terrain, weather, and the strength or weakness of the Entente defence as it did on German tactical excellence. In other words, it's not all about the Germans. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that the BEF, as I said, has survived the worst by the end of April. We also know that Ludendorff's attempts to break the French over the balance of the summer would fail, and that at the Second Battle of the Marne, beginning on the 15th of July 1918, the initiative shifted for the last time from the Germans to the Allies. But of course, to Haig and to Foch and to Pétain at the time, on the ground in the spring and summer of 1918, none of that was evident. They could see, it's true, that the tempo of German offensives had declined, but they could still see that the German army had plenty of reserves left most of the time, and that it was within 60 kilometres of three potentially key objectives: Paris, Calais, and Abbeville. In other words, potentially one good German victory away from possibly some kind of decisive effect. So as a result, the BEF still thought itself correctly under real and imminent danger. And it spent May, June, July on a defensive footing, replacing losses and casualties, training men up, rebuilding lines of communication and building networks of supply, and organising new defensives. By late June, they were able to go back, start thinking about counteroffensives, and then when, as I say, during the Second Battle of the Marne, the German offensive finally started to falter. The French and Americans launched a very successful counterattack on the 18th of July, and thereafter the Allies never lost the initiative again, beating the Germans back in battles such as Amiens, the Meuse-Argonne, breaking of the Hindenburg Line, the Fifth Ypres, the Sambre, and the Selle, until finally the Germans capitulated in the famous railway carriage at Compiègne. Now, I'm not going to discuss this Allied counteroffensive in detail, partly because I was told not to, partly because many of you in this room have heard me talk about the 100 days far too much for one lifetime, never mind more. But what I would like to do, just to finish up, is to explore some of the foundations of Allied success. And the first thing I want to talk about is materiel and logistics. By 1918, firepower and mechanical warfare was taking the place of manpower. And men increasingly were necessary only to support the machines. To give you one example, a famous example, battalions, as you will know, British infantry battalions went to war in 1914 with 2 Vickers machine guns per battalion. By 1918, each infantry battalion had 36 Lewis guns, and of course could call on further support from the Vickers machine guns of the machine gun companies. And it took about 200 men, or half the fighting establishment of a British infantry battalion in 1918, just to keep the Lewis guns operating. To do that, however, required industry to be geared up to provide those machines and indeed everything else that the soldiers needed to fight. And by 1917, 1918, that industry had been geared up. So written-off aircraft, for example, could be replaced very rapidly. The RFC, RAF suffered extremely heavy losses in the first days of the German offensives in March 1918. By the 8th of April, so within 2.5 weeks, the RAF had more aeroplanes in the air in action than it had had on the 21st of March, despite those losses, an incredible logistic achievement. As you will again know, by autumn 1918, the British artillery was able to fire off 3 times the weight of shells that it had been able to fire on the Somme in 1916 in a week. So where the BEF had really been living from hand to mouth in 1914, 1916, by the time of the armistice, it had plenty of munitions immediately on hand and coming through from the factories. The second point, however, is an obvious one. Possessing all the weapons in the world is only of limited value if you don't know what to do with them. Now, there's no question to my mind that the British Army, often via a process of trial and error, had ascended a range of individual learning curves or undergone a range of individual learning processes, if you prefer, developed experience and new skills. Just to give you 2, again, fairly obvious examples. David Jordan has shown how by the summer of 1918, the RAF was undertaking essentially all the missions that modern aviation still undertakes in war today by the end of the war. Does that make sense? Yes. They had discovered all the different things that you could do with an aeroplane to fight, and were doing them not exactly the same way, of course, as the RAF does them today, but with the same, in a similar fashion, a recognizable fashion, anyway. Another example, if you wanted to fire off an artillery shell with the increased accuracy that was possible in 1918, well, then your ability to do that depended on new techniques and new inventions in a whole range of fields, which included survey, aerial photography, meteorology, metallurgy, fuse and propellant technology, communications, command, control, and intelligence. To then employ that shell to the best possible effect required a sophisticated grasp of tactics and of operational art. And nothing was possible at all without mastery of the logistic skills necessary not only to transport the shell to the gun and make sure the gun was working, but also to keep the crew fed, clothed, watered, and ready to fire. The third point I want to talk about is the fact that the army had learnt not only how to fight, but also how to learn. It had evolved a process or processes, I should say, to capture lessons learned, distill the most important, and revise best practice through new doctrine. Sometimes the new approaches were codified and published in documents such as the SS pamphlets, which many of you will be familiar with, or other instructions. Other doctrine, in inverted commas, was disseminated through many informal channels of communication, which linked the army within and between theatres scattered all over the world. Consciously or by accident, the Army had managed to construct a highly flexible and effective system of learning systems operating simultaneously down multiple different channels, each characterized by varying degrees of formality and central control to spread the word and ensure that innovation and adaptation was as effective and as efficient as it could possibly be. I think other aspects were also important to British victory. I haven't really got time to go into them now. We can talk about them more in Q&A if you like. First of all, Britain understood the kind of war it was fighting, could see how it ended, and had devised an appropriate way of fighting it. Secondly, Britain was working very well within her alliances, note the plural. And thirdly, morale and leadership were very, very good. But overall, however, if you want to see how much more potent a weapon the British Army constituted by the end of 1918, all we actually need to do is to compare the BF's position at the beginning and end of the year. In January and February, as we saw, it squatted on the defensive, apparently paralysed by the High Command reorganisation, High Command reshuffle, I beg your pardon, and the swinging reorganisation of the ranks, awaiting a German offensive, which it expected to be able to contain, but had no thought of preempting. By the end of the year, in contrast, the BF had launched multiple major offensives, employing up to 5 armies at once, in less time than it had taken to plan an attack by just one army in 1916. And it had defeated the German army time and again, outfighting it in trench warfare and in more mobile operations alike. And all of this had been achieved while continually advancing, as Haig and Foch employed with great success, a form of rolling attrition designed to chew through German reserves of manpower, as well as continually forcing the Germans back. The logistic achievement, to my mind, was hardly less impressive than the fighting performance. The BEF had played a leading role in defeating the most feared army in the world, the military which had set the standard worldwide since the 1860s, at least. To fight a successful defensive battle and then make the transition to a victorious offensive is one of the hardest things to pull off in war. Montgomery managed it in the desert in 1942. Bill Slim managed it in the jungle in 1944-45. But impressive as both campaigns were, neither, I think, can compete in scale or importance with the achievement of Douglas Haig's BEF on the Western Front in 1918. For the first and the last time in history, I've said it before, I'll say it again, the British Army defeated the enemy's main force in the main theatre of operations. The fact that it managed to do so while also projecting British power around the whole globe, literally from Archangel to Zanzibar, only makes the achievement more impressive. But the story of 1918 as a world war is definitely one for another day and another audience. Thank you very much.
If you want to find the private, I know where he is. He's hanging on the old barbed wire. I saw him, hanging on the old barbed wire, hanging on the old